Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 13th of August, and in today's upload we're once again looking at the tactical situation northeast of Pokrovsk and directly to the east of the city of Dobropilya. I want to look at the ever so expansive Russian salient that has developed in recent days and in recent weeks, and we want to look at the first pieces of footage coming out of Russian POWs captured by a new Ukrainian brigade that has been deployed to this region for the first time. And so we're going to look at my new understanding of where the Ukrainian forces are deployed. We're going to zoom in and look at 14 settlements that are being evacuated of their civilian populations and specifically families that contain children. So we'll look at which locations are actually being mandatorily evacuated by the governor of Donetsk, and they are around Dnipropetrovsk specifically. We're going to look at advances that are going on in Zari to the west of the Zherbets River. We'll look at an update from Zaporizhzhia as well. And furthermore, I want to discuss the political situation. In the end of the video, I'll devote to it a pretty good chunk of time where I just discuss every single party's interest, what they're looking to achieve going into the meeting between Putin and Trump on August 15th, Friday in Anchorage. We're going to try to explain the meta situation from a political standpoint, and I'll just give my thoughts on all that. But let's zoom in and get into the minutia from the front line over here with the salient now becoming more and more solidified. That's one of the key themes of this video. The fact that the Russian forces, yes, they've been able to, since the later portions of July, expand control and get certain corridors open to them, at least in a gray zone. Now they've actually been able to solidify control, and that's been a major talking point for the past 3 days. And we have a better idea of where the line of contact actually stands. So the Russian DRGs are now starting to expand, not necessarily in a vertical direction towards an even further north penetration, because you look at their advance vertically and it spans like 15 kilometers depending on where you're looking at the gray zone. It could be even 17 kilometers northwards. And so you're looking at a really deep advance from that dimension. But there is also an effort now to broaden the Russian horizon, and doing so for two reasons. First of all, to approach the eastern outskirts of Dobropilya, that's extremely important, and then also to close in on the Terets River Valley, which is something that I'm pretty confident will happen, especially due to this advance that occurred today, but also due to the fact that you look at the Russian accumulation or concentration, rather, of FAB strikes, and you can just see that this particular region over here, with these clusters of villages spanning from Volodymyrivka all the way to an area like Priut or Torske, they've been incessantly targeted. Houses over there are being flattened. You have certain trenches that are running along the perimeter of these villages being targeted as well. And of course, the hedgerows and tree lines on the flanks. So there is a systematic effort by the Russian Air Force to just suppress Ukrainian positions over here and make it possible for an attack that would occur along the flanks. So that's certainly a consideration as well, and it all would be a focus, a primary focus, more so than advancing further northwards and deepening the vertical attack. Because the thing is, the Ukrainian side, as it was reiterating in earlier videos, their ultimate objective, or I would say their immediate goal, is to ensure that the DRGs cannot cut off the highway between Dobropilya and Kramatorsk, because that would deny not only the city of Dobropilya, but also all the dozens of other settlements around here, including the ones that are in Dnipro, and including the ones further northwards, like Bilozerske, a very important fallback line for the Ukrainians is built around that region, or any other town that's of medium size, like Novodonetsk, Alexandrivka. It would make it far more difficult for them to achieve a level of stable connectivity with the much larger parts of the Donbass defensive network that consists of areas like Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk. So that's a part of why they would want to do it. And it's also because we looked at the elevation map yesterday. They don't want to give the Russians an opportunity to seize control over this important watershed location, this really massive height, and then from there, all the ridges branch out. So the Russians haven't necessarily taken over all of it. For the most part, it's still under Ukrainian control, but it is an exposed area, which is why it's in urgent need of reinforcements. So that's why the Russian side, from one hand, they may prefer to just focus on other areas where they have a higher degree of success and could actually take over a lot of populated regions that are part of their overarching objective of just clearing up the flanks. And so I just want to zoom in over here and look at the specifics. So first of all, Rubizhny. Rubizhny is currently in a gray zone, according to the general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces. They're alleging that there are Russian forces infiltrating over here, and naturally they can do that through Zoloty Kolidia. So that's one of the major advantages of having control over a populated area like this. They can then branch out from there and attack along ravines because there are a lot of good paths over here that do provide concealment, and then arrive at Rubizhny. So for now, it is contested. Furthermore, there are reports of clashes going on to the south and to the north of Rubizhny. So for now, the situation over there is not fully clarified, but it appears as if these ravines are split, and then the area in between is in a gray zone. And you can see the same thing for some of the forested positions that are also located a bit to the south of the village. So there is currently a close quarters battle going on between both sides in this location, and that would provide either side the leverage they need in order to secure control over the entirety of Rubizhny. And for the Russian side, taking over Rubizhny would be extremely critical because then you could imagine they'd have a very strong northeastern flank from which they can cut off the rail line and by extension all these other defensive fortifications, mainly in this location, anti-tank ditches and Dragon's Teeth. And then from there, they have access actually to the highway over here or to areas that are nearby, and they can move along that route through largely open areas, as we were reiterating, and arrive towards a lower lying area like the Beek River, which is overlooked from the Russian positions they were attacking from. For instance, in an area that's near Rubizhny, just to the north of it, for instance, that would be a higher elevated point. And then they'd have an area of infiltration, just one of several, because they are already working to pave a route directly to the east from Vilna and towards Novodonbassy. But for now, that region, the advance that I'm talking about, has not really been exploited. We just don't have enough concrete information to say that they've been able to advance any further than the 6.7 kilometer gap that currently exists. But yes, it is true that there is a particular emphasis now on Rubizhny for that reason. And in this region, you do have a lot of efforts by the 4th Rubizh Brigade and the 1st Assault Regiment Da Vinci's Wolves. And for that matter, the Ukrainians have deployed a lot of these smaller assault regiments or battalions to this region, not just to here, but to the entire Pokrovsk front, because they may not be the most abundant when it comes to their manpower pool, but they do have specialties and expertise in conducting localized counterattacks, fighting positionally, trying to drag out fighting in houses and in fortified posts. So that's the reason why they're getting deployed. But in any case, you have a couple of other units over here, like the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, 91st Anti-Tank Battalion. But I do want to mention that the 12th National Guard Brigade is very active around here, and they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting now that they've been redeployed to this region and redirected from the Klemenbeek Reservoir area. So they're fighting to secure the highway, and there's actually footage that was from August 12th of a Ukrainian volunteer driving southwards through the village of Novotroitska, and they showed around, and you can see at that moment that there are DRGs, and that's to be expected because a DRG is not strolling around 24/7, especially in a village like that. They would be hiding in one of the nearby forested regions or in a tree line, a hedgerow, or a gully over here. But regardless, this area has always been marked as blue, so it's not that much of a change. But it does imply that there is still movement going on back and forth through the highway, even though this region over here is still considered to be a gray zone. So we'll have to see what actions the 12th Brigade takes in tandem with the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 92nd Assault Brigade, try to reduce the potential issues for the supply lines leading into Dobropilia, which are, regardless of what happens over here, extremely compromised due to the battles going on in Rubizhny. Besides that fact, there are also clashes currently developing in the areas east of Zolty Kolodyaz, because there are efforts by Russian DRGs to expand past Veselite and Hrutske, and there's actually some rumors, so this is not confirmed, and that's why I've not changed the map, but there are rumors of the Russian DRGs reaching the road that connects between Novoandrivka over here to Druskivka. So let me zoom out so you guys can see what I'm referring to. So you can see there's a paved route over here coming in from the west, and it starts out in the area just south of Novoandrivka and then connects to Druskivka. So it's a very important route, and the Russians are actually on the same sort of trajectory to arriving at this road, and so that's why it would be a feasible option for DRGs to try to cut it off and gain control over some of it. So there is an expanded gray zone over here because there are currently clashes going on near this clay mine and industrial facility. There are also a couple of warehouses and a small settlement that I'm not sure what it's called. I don't know whether it's attached to Nova Mykolaiv or not, but for sure DRGs are voluminous at this point in Vesele and Hruske. But that's not to say that the Ukrainians on their part are not counterattacking in this area or not trying to at the very least, because we have now received information of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade getting redeployed to this part of the front line. And, previously my map showed that the 93rd Mechanized Brigade was operating in an area to the east of the Klosnitnivka front or Kleban Peak front, whatever you want to call it, basically in the areas near Belivka and Bilahora. And that was not necessarily the case. At a certain point in time in recent months, the 93rd Brigade was operating over there. They were also operating in regions that are a bit south of Chasiv Yar near the entire Donbass Canal region, but it was largely in reserves. It was receiving this entire time slots of rotation after just intense fighting over several months. And previously, before it engaged in fighting in the Donetsk region, it was also already operated in the areas directly south of Pokrovsk before the situation did deteriorate over there. So it already has some certain experience along this part of the line of contact, but now it's being redeployed because obviously it was one of the few units that is of a high caliber and was available. And so it was moved in to sort of plug the gaps over here. So they released footage of 4 Russian POWs that were captured, and they were filmed in a house, but the claimed geolocation of where they were captured is over here, which is why I'm marking it as a gray zone, despite the fact that there still are Russian soldiers in Vesele itself. The Ukrainian sources on their part, they claimed that there are 20 Russian soldiers still operating in this small village. You can see it over here. It's basically just one block. So there are 20 over here. And then you could imagine that there are several more in Truska and in any area that's to the north of it. And as you go further south, there are going to be further and even larger quantities of Russian troops. So you're looking at 20 over here. Maybe you're looking at 40 over here. And then as you cascade southwards, the numbers begin to increase. And I don't know if it's linearly. And so you're looking at this part of the front line, and there are obviously indications due to the geolocation that the 93rd Brigade is trying to just continue putting that pressure on these 2 villages so the Russians can't fully solidify control over here. That's their hope, because a full Russian solidification over here would mean that, first of all, there is an opportunity to reach the highway, to reach the paved road over here. There's also opportunities to solidify control over the northwestern flank towards the Terets River line, because there certainly could be a Russian push to squeeze the Ukrainians out of these populated areas. And then from there, what would be the objective? The objective would be to get control over a very large swath of open fields that would flank Druskivka and also Konstantinivka to a lesser degree, but more so Druskivka from the southwestern and southern axes directly. So I can sort of depict that over here. You have this large open field region that's on high elevation to the west of the Terets River line. You also have this line to the east, again, on a really high elevation. And so it would be squeezed out naturally based on the 2 flanks. And then from there, you have the route needed in order to arrive at Druskivka itself. And moreover, you have these fields over here that are not necessarily the most well defended, directly south of the city, that can also be used to overlook and dominate the valley on which this town is located. And same thing would go for any other activities that are going on along this road over here, slightly to the southwest of the city. So again, that's a part of the broader planning, but I do think, and this is something that I must reiterate, the immediate concern is regarding Pokrovsk and Dobropilya and efforts to ensure that the Ukrainians cannot build up a garrison over there to drag out fighting. They're trying to ensure that the perimeters, that the flanks are sufficiently undermined such that there can be a Salidova scenario where the Ukrainians no longer have the ability to hold out and are forced out. And so that's part of why more of the Russian emphasis is actually on the western direction, although there's also this eastern prong, because another objective is to just cancel out this entire river line as well. So that's more about the consideration over here, and the Ukrainians are naturally trying to prevent this from happening by redeploying this force over here. Although, again, I have to reiterate, this is probably not going to be enough. And they're also moving into 25th Assault Battalion, another one of these smaller units I was talking about that have the ability to counterattack or to fight in difficult situations. So you have them, and then you have this geolocation over here. So this is from 1.37 square kilometers of territory in the videos from the Fakhivtsi drone units, which is a part of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. And so They are once again very active around here, trying to retain control over all the fortified areas, the labyrinth of trenches and dugouts that were set up over here. And there are still several layers of them that the Russians have not overrun. So that's going to be an objective of theirs, because taking them over would give them the necessary open fields to arrive at the southern flank that I was just describing to you guys. So that's why there is this penetration in this region. And again, it was just grenade drops onto the trenches where the Russians were occupying. And this also means that, once again, the flanks that are directly, because if we're looking on a tactical level, these movements are meant to get control over this line of that basically runs along ponds and also runs along some of the anti-tank ditches and dragon's teeth that were built over here. So then the effort would be to move directly westwards, and then from there flank Shachove, Volodymyrivka, Sofivka, etc. So that's what's going on over there. The Ukrainians, actually, their chief sergeant for the 93rd Mechanized Brigade claims that the bulk of Russian soldiers that are currently attacking along this salient are young and trained. So they are, some of them, special forces operators, and they're between the ages of 20 to 26. That's what he's claiming, and largely coming from the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade. Again, really important unit from the 51st Army Corps, or 51st Combined Arms Army, rather, and the 51st CAA, if you guys recall, it used to be the 1st Army Corps, meaning it was basically the DPR's forces. And so they're very active around here on this northeastern flank, on this salient, and they've done a lot of the cutting edge work to push the mantle forward in this location. So that's, while we still have information of DRGs being very active around Belitske, Shevchenko, and even as far as Novo-Alexandrivka, but nothing that's actually materially confirmed, like an extended presence, nothing that's I can use to sort of indicate that the Russians have actually been able to achieve a permanent advance. But still keep an eye out over here for this movement, because these DRG activities do have the potential to squeeze the Ukrainians out. Because you look at it right now, and not including the actual DRGs and not disregarding the gray zone, just looking at the Ukrainians' control over here, it is about 9-10 kilometers. So you're looking at an ever so small and decreasing corridor for escape. And so it's getting more and more concentrated in several key roads. So definitely keep an eye out for that activity. There's also a lot of resurging information about the Russians entering into Chervony Liman, which has been the case now for a while. Since August 3rd, we've known about their entrance over here, but we don't know if they've been able to push any deeper. If they would, then it would give them the opportunity to attack Rodinska from the south, and that would be the final nail in the coffin for like a southern approach. And then from there, basically the entire eastern perimeter would be assaulted head on. So it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold onto those positions. Reports of the Russians taking over Novoekonomichny, to my knowledge, are not fully true yet. And there's now, again, recycling of information that occurred several weeks ago, but maybe wasn't necessarily confirmed up until now, because the Ukrainian sources and the Russian ones alike aren't necessarily being fed all the information that they once were, either due to Russian operational security measures meant to protect their forces during deep rear advances, or from the Ukrainian side trying to prevent any sort of leakage of bad news. And so now it's coming out from Petrenko, for instance, that they've been able to take over the Russians, in this case, the village of Leontivichi. But this has been pretty clear since the Russians have used this route in order to send in DRGs into the center of the city for several weeks now. So, yeah, that's not much of a new development. What is new, though, is the fact that the Russian side, or rather the Ukrainian side, and this was announced by the governor of Donetsk Oblast, Vadim Filashkin, he announced that in this case, the Ukrainian side, they are evacuating 14 settlements, and these are mandatory evacuations for families that include children. So other civilians are allowed to remain, but civilians and families in this case that have minors, they are going to be forced to evacuate. So these 14, I'll show them on the map, but they start off with Belozerske. So you can see it over here, Belozerske, really important town that would be sort of the successor to Dobropilia if that fell, because the entire defense line is built to defend it, and it's also located on the highest elevation over here. And so now it's being evacuated, and the Ukrainians hope to use the apartment blocks and the entire sort of residential structure to hold out over here. There are really good basements, I would presume, in this area, but it is just very small in surface area, like Rodinska, like Belitska, and so it has that sort of natural disadvantage as a result. But it is surrounded by a lot of smaller settlements as well, and so those regions are also going to be evacuated, like Blachodat, you can see it over here, Veselopole, Vesna, Mirove, Novovodiane, and Novovodiane, you can see it over here, and then all the other accompanying villages. You have Zvia to Horivka, that's over here, so just to the west of Dobropilia as well. Viktorivka, also nearby. Virivka, Kupani, Novoviktorivka, and you can see that over here, for instance, and Novoukrayinka. So if we look at what this entails, it would include evacuations of these regions and then also the line around Belozersk and then a bit further to the north as well. So that's generally the region we're looking at. And these evacuations occur usually when the Russian side approaches not the villages themselves, but the line right before these villages. And so the second to last sort of layer of defenses before it. So that would sort of imply that the Ukrainians are now sort of anticipating that a lot of the efforts will be on Dobropilia, and then from there, as a natural extension, it would also be on Belozersk afterwards. So they're already taking the preemptive measure in this location, and there is genuinely a fear of not necessarily like occupation, but certainly one DRG on their own could actually infiltrate to a really deep degree into some of these regions, like we saw with the bus station in Dobropilia, and try to cause some sort of undermining of the cohesiveness in an area along this line over here. And so that's not out of the question in the near future. But as the Ukrainians send in reinforcements, again, they're going to try to solidify this eastern flank of Belozersk first and foremost, because a route over there would just lead to further and further degradation all across this part of sort of like the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. And so it would be far more wide ranging than closing in on two pockets over here, like in Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. And so that's why I don't think it's really likely at all. But regardless, those evacuations do indicate that the Ukrainians are taking the situation more seriously now because they understand there has actually been a major shift in the dynamics on the ground. So that's pretty much it for the Pokrovsk region. We'll update you guys once there's like a more solid information because yet again, we saw basically a laundry list of information released yesterday and 2 days ago, but that was all culminating and building up over the course of several weeks. And now it was released in a sort of one huge dump. And now, once again, we're receiving secrecy as both sides are engaged in really intense fighting. And still, they're trying to maintain that sort of ambiguity, and it has a direct sort of correspondence on the battlefield as a result. Let's look at Zaporizhzhia over here because the Russian forces were able to advance, and I want to zoom in on that capture. So they took over what amounts to 1.14 square kilometers of territory. Based on a geolocation from the 63rd Mechanized Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes onto houses and infantry in northern Zaporizhzhia, just further verifying footage previously of this motorcycle assault that crossed over the Zherbis River and took over a large chunk of that settlement. And so now the Russians are continuing to expand their footprint and trying to just ensure that they have a very strong bridgehead across this river. From there, they would have direct access to Liman, or they could sort of move southwards using the positions that they gained eventually in Torska and utilize the forested areas to arrive at the southern flank of Liman. Either way, they would have options, and the Ukrainians would be moved out of a buffer that's supposed to prevent direct attacks on Liman. So that's the situation there. And then in Zaporizhzhia, we have this footage that was released by the Ukrainian side by the 210th Assault Regiment Berlingo, wherein they did conduct a localized counterattack and took back District 3 of Stepnohirsk. We can see over here that the geolocation indicates an advance of about 2.2 square kilometers. It shows that there were 5 Ukrainian soldiers a part of that regiment, and they essentially in this region were able to push back the Russian side and their forces that were holding out over here, and were able to do this at the southern tip of the microdistrict, and were complemented by a barrage of FPV strikes. So this, coupled with information from Deep State, does indicate that the Russian side has, at least for now, been pushed out of their forwardmost positions in this area, but it also indicates that up until now, the Russians were actually over here. Despite a lot of reporting from Ukrainian sources that they were pushed out previously, it turns out that they were holding out over here as the map depicted over here that we talked about for a while. But now the Ukrainians utilizing this unit that is specifically made for these types of combat missions where you have to take back a location in close proximity to the front line. Now they've been able to do it over here, and it's an advance, let's see how much it amounts to, of, 900 meters going southwards. And so look at the political situation. There is going to be the meeting, of course, in Anchorage, and that's going to occur Friday, August 15th. And now leading up to that today, especially, it's been a really busy day because you have leaders from the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, so the big three of Europe, and they were coordinating on behalf of Ukraine with the United States, and there were video calls lasting about an hour with Trump and JD Vance. And the entire reason for doing is that the entire objective was to try to get on the same page with Trump, to try to push him not to give overtures to Putin during the entire conversation, because again, at some point it's going to just be completely one-on-one between Trump and Putin, their discussion. And so they were just trying to lobby Trump and convince him that there have to be certain measures taken, certain conditions that need to be fulfilled in order to actually agree on Ukraine's behalf to some sort of peace settlement. So for the Ukrainians, for their parts, and this was reported on by Politico, so again, maybe some of the demands may not be necessarily completely true, but Politico is saying that there were 5 main points discussed by the Ukrainian side that they reiterate are critical in order to actually get the war completed and that they would be willing to agree to. So they claim that the Ukrainians are demanding a durable ceasefire, and that this ceasefire would not include a withdrawal from territory in Donetsk. So they are not agreeing to a unilateral withdrawal from Donetsk. What they may agree to is territorial swaps based on the basis of the front line. And so that's something that Merz, for instance, continued to highlight. And he talked about it as a potential like starting points. And then from there could be territorial swaps that are pretty much equal in size. But in terms of a complete withdrawal from Donetsk, the Ukrainians have made it very clear, both Zelensky himself and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they made it completely clear that those sort of demands they're not going to accept. And the reasons why is because they are worried that then Russia would use it as a springboard to attack into Dnipro or to Zaporizhzhia. And then they also use this entire excuse of the Constitution for not allowing to recognize any territory ceded. But again, that's not really significant because, again, everything could be de facto and it would just completely nullify those concerns. And so the Ukrainians are opposed to this condition that the Russians stipulated as a bare minimum during their meeting with Witkoff. And actually, according to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, today their statement said that they are demanding as a baseline that there be recognition, or perhaps that could be changed later on, just de facto recognition of their control of all 4 oblasts that they annexed in their entirety. So that would include all of Donetsk, which is already a non-starter for Ukraine. It would include all of Zaporizhzhia, of which you have around like 28%, I think, that is pretty much still Ukrainian territory, including the capital of the oblast, the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. And then you have in Kherson, the capital itself of the oblast, once again, under Ukrainian control. And so if the oblast demand for Donetsk was already too much, and you can imagine how the Ukrainians would be completely unwilling to cede control of those 4 regions in any way through a peaceful settlement. They're just simply not willing to agree to that. And that's one of the main reasons why I'm just not confident of any settlement being achieved when you look at how there are such glaring contradictions. But okay, that's one particular component that the Ukrainians are talking about. The second component comes in the form of security guarantees. So Zelensky has been pushing very hard ever since Trump was elected for, yes, ceasefire, and that afterwards the ceasefire would lead to a long-standing peace, but that it could only be enforced through a security guarantee. So the United States, even under Biden, but especially under Trump, has been very hesitant to agree to such a term. They don't want to be embroiled in a foreign conflict directly with the Russian side over Ukraine, and so that's why they've never really been receptive to the idea. But in order to try to get to a compromise, you had Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, proposed this coalition of the willing, which consists of 31 states, mainly Europe, but also some in like Australia, New Zealand, East Asia, that are supposed to send in peacekeepers to enforce any sort of ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And the mechanics have to be worked out. We don't know if they would be deployed to the front line, whether Russia would even agree to that, or whether they would be deployed to other areas in Ukraine, which wouldn't really make much of a difference besides freeing up space for Ukrainians to move their forces to the front line entirely. So again, that's something that, for instance, the Ukrainians may not even agree is sufficient enough. And then on the Russian side, they may think that's too much in the first place because it goes against their entire reason for continuing the war and for starting in the first place, of their worries of Western interference in the country. And so, yeah, you think about all that, and this is another very significant sticking point that has not been addressed. And, maybe between Trump and Putin, they can find common ground, but then between all two of both of them in Ukraine, there is no way to find congruency for the time being. And another important step for Zelensky would be either direct U.S. sort of security guarantees that would be like an independent treaty, and if not that, then they would want first and foremost acceptance in the EU, which is just an important starting point for them. It's not the end point. They also want to join NATO as a condition as well for ending the war. And that's once again completely in contradiction to what the Russians want, because the Russians, they want as a sort of first step to even agreeing to a ceasefire, a commitment from NATO to never accept Ukraine. And so that's just completely in contradiction. And that's once again a stumbling block. You also have the issue of reparations. The Ukrainians are demanding 500 billion euros in reparations due to the damages caused during the war. And some of that they propose would be paid for using the 200 million or billion, sorry, euros of frozen Russian assets in Brussels. And then there's also some in the United States. But again, that would once again demand the Russians, spending a significant sum of money to aid the country they've been at war with for 3 years. Again, completely in contradiction to what the Russians want, which would be to never invest that sort of money into a state that they just fought a war with. And so, again, that's another term that can not be fulfilled, although I think it's something that is more peripheral and it's not really a main issue. And if all other issues were somehow in a miracle sort of addressed, then this would not be a reason why the deal would fall through, in my opinion. And then the fourth condition is about returning 20,000 Ukrainian children that are in the Russian foster care system or the orphanage system or were adopted in some form, and then all of the Ukrainian POWs. Again, a peripheral issue that could very easily be resolved without a ceasefire or after all other terms are agreed to. So it's really not something that is a primary contradiction between either side. And then five, they don't want to allow, or they don't want Western countries to ease sanctions on Russia, at least during the immediate moment after a ceasefire. They perhaps would agree to it after a certain period of time. The Ukrainians, they would permit other countries to do so as a way of sort of providing incentive for continuing the ceasefire, or then snapping them back in case there is some sort of continuation of the war at some point. But they want it to be a sort of carrot and stick approach, and they don't want the unilateral repeal of the sanctions that many Western countries have. So that's a bit on what Zelensky wants, and that, and the differences between that and what the Russians are demanding. What they reportedly agrees with Witkoff, which isn't even as radical or as demanding as what the Russians announced today, that they want all four oblasts that they annexed to be ceded to them by Ukraine. Either way, it's just completely a disparity, and common ground is simply not possible under those terms. But between Trump and Putin, it is a bit more of a different matter, because Trump, for his part, he is trying to sweeten up a deal that would be conducive for Russia to make them, to basically create the conditions that would allow them to agree to a deal. And so the deliberation started off with Witkoff going there and saying that, okay, the front line will be frozen, and then perhaps you'll withdraw from areas like Dnipro, Sumy, Kharkiv, and then take over the entirety of Donetsk. But again, it takes two parties to agree to that. But now let's just look at the American perspective in relation to Russia. And so Trump, he is offering two competing approaches now that actually go hand in hand as a sort of dialectic. So one would be that he's looking at a way to sweeten the deal by increasing investment in Russia, improving economic cooperation between the Russians and the Americans. And so the Treasury Secretary is looking at ways that rare earth minerals can be extracted from territory that's been captured by the Russians in Ukraine, and then that could be a way to boost the Russian economy. So there's obviously a huge amount of lithium in Ukraine. It's about 10% of the global supply, and there are two massive deposits that are located in areas controlled by the Russian side. And so that could be a way to sort of entice the Russians, but it's already under their control. So what would they be agreeing to? So the question is, would the United States open up investments to deposits to extraction, or would it just be de facto recognition of these territories that are already de facto under Russian control? So either way, it's not necessarily the most convincing from a Russian perspective. But there are other terms. There's a work on, increased economic cooperation, on reducing sanctions on Russian aviation, and that could just be the tip of the iceberg. There could be far more sanctions relief discussed during the meeting, and maybe there will be joint projects between both sides. There are reports that the natural resources in Alaska would be opened up and provided to Russia in some sort of agreement. So those are all ways to entice Putin to agree to some sort of agreement. But again, these are peripheral issues, and when you look at like the benefits outweighing like the costs that the Russians have already incurred and what they are seeking to gain from Ukraine, then it's certainly not enough to change Russia's entire strategic outlook. Like permits in Alaska, or buying like natural gas, or I don't know, buying some sort of a reserve of minerals in Alaska is not sufficient to actually force the Russians or convince them that the war in Ukraine should be ended, especially on conditions that they are completely opposed to, that would have to be sort of figured out, and they would have to meet in the middle with Ukraine. So I'm just trying to say that again, the chances of anything being worked out that's actually substantial in the long run for an agreement, even if there are certain photos and even if the meeting becomes amicable between both sides, it's still very, very low, and I'm just not convinced about it at all. And so this is a really important meeting regardless, because we're going to see how the United States decides to shift its stature towards the war, and its the way in which it tries to achieve peace, whether it even wants to do it anymore after this meeting. Because Trump did warn that there would be severe consequences for Russia if they're unwilling to head in the direction of a ceasefire. And so then you look at a whole host of options opening up, and this is more of the sort of really stringent approach. Instead of offering rewards, offering sort of different pressure points to force the Russians into an agreement. So you're looking at secondary sanctions, doubling down on the sanctions that should be implemented later on in August on India. Again, second largest importer of Russian energy, and then it would be on China, perhaps. And again, the United States would also take hits to their economy in the process if that were to stay in the long run, but also that would be a way to really chip at the Russians' coffers and target some of their main trading partners, India and China, namely, and then perhaps even other BRICS countries if they reach that point. So that's just one option that's up for consideration, and then whether Trump goes ahead with it is dependent on how much he's willing to risk, American standing, or American economic standing as well, in the hopes of forcing Russia into this agreement. But regardless of whether that happens or whether it's just a way to just sort of pressure Russia through media reports, there's also the fact that they may be trying to go after Russia's vessels, their vessels that still send energy to countries in the West, that still have contracts with these Russian companies, and they do so sometimes under certain company names that aren't explicitly mentioning that they're from Russia and such. And so, colloquially in the Western press, they like to call it the shadow fleet or whatever. And, there's several hundred fleets or several hundred vessels. And now a lot of them are starting to get targeted individually. So individual vessels are getting sanctioned. And that's a way to reduce the amount of volume that comes from Russia into Europe. That, again, is important for Russian economy to, increase its revenue and economic output. And so that's another option. And then you could look at increased aid to Ukraine, increase in long-range missiles to target the Russian rear, those sort of actions. And so obviously the Russians have an interest, even if it's not genuine in ending the war or genuine in achieving a ceasefire right now. And you could imagine why, because they perhaps do see that there are ambitions even past the four blasts, perhaps with the buffer zone on the border with Ukraine, or deepening their advance into Kharkiv and Dnipro and such. And so they would have those territorial aspirations, and they would also have the political aspiration of just completely reducing the influence that the West has, and thereby increasing their own influence on Ukrainian politics and sovereignty, and obviously security arrangements. And so those reasons would also incentivize them to continue with the war. And so I think that maximum pressure scenario is certainly one possibility, but there's also possibility floated by many people that then, let's say, Putin is receptive, and then Trump sort of shifts his focus to getting Zelensky to agree, and Zelensky holds out on those conditions, like, no, we're not going to withdraw unilaterally from an entire oblast and then hand over the defensive lines over there. And then Trump sort of shifts his arrow over there, and then as a result, there could be effects on the shipments to Ukraine. That's another one. But then there's also the what I believe to be one of the more realistic routes, and the one that is more so middle ground, which would be that the United States just sort of gives up on the entire project of ending the war and just gradually reduces its footprint over a couple of years and just gives Ukraine sustenance to continue the war, but only doing enough to keep it afloat, and then doing so via intermediaries in Europe. So selling equipment to Europe, and then the Europeans deploy that and send it to the Ukrainians, and then that sort of roundabout way of sending in several billion every year, just trickling in, will be enough to keep an attritional war going on for a couple of years. And that would be one of the more likely scenarios, as the United States then would have less of a focus on the region, as they once again have so many other commitments besides Ukraine when it comes to weapons, when it comes to diplomatic attention, when it comes to what sort of economic levers they want to push and pull, because they have a whole host of other strategic interests besides this one in particular. And just sort of placing all their cards into this one issue, it does become sort of myopic and ignores other areas. And so this has been a huge point mentioned by people like Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary for Defense Policy, who is extremely big on the concept of eventually shifting focus to China and Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Philippines, and to a certain degree also Indochina. And so that will once again be a very important point, and a point of friction, I should say, between the United States and China going into the late 2020s. And then also you have the considerations in the Middle East, because once again, ramping up tensions between Israel and Iran. The entire Iran deal basically expires on the 15th of October this year. And so at that point, there would no more constraints would be on Iran when it comes to what sort of obligations they have to fulfill. And at the same time, you have the Israelis ramping up for a scenario in which they conduct an attack, and one that is actually more powerful than the one they conducted last July, this July rather. And so there are a whole lot of other considerations when it comes to American stockpiles, whether it be from a Patriot system or such. And so that's something that they need to keep in consideration as well. And yeah, that's why I do think that the idea, the concept of the United States having some sort of maximum pressure campaign, especially when it comes to military aid, that is noticeably different than what's already been happening, is just simply unlikely. I think that the United States is looking to try to expand its own production and ensure that it has enough to protect itself domestically. That's been a big sort of sticking point for Pete Hegseth and for the Pentagon as he's been over there. And it is a worry of theirs that they get depleted due to the fact that they are fighting on three fronts at least, via allies and such. And so that's all out for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.